The most deadly Appalachian. The macabre tale of Bertha Hood. Just before we get into it, I want to ask you something. Where on earth are you right now? And what's the time where you are? Let me know in the comments down below. The November wind sliced through the Cumberland Mountains like a frozen blade, bringing with it the scent of coal smoke and wood fires drifting from the scattered homesteads spread across Wise County, Virginia. It was 1930, and the Great Depression had sunk its claws deep into the heart of Appalachia. Yet life in the hollers went on as it always had, hard, slow, and bound by blood and tradition. Big Stone Gap sat tucked in a valley cradled by ancient mountains, their peaks wrapped in a constant veil of mist. The town had flourished in the late 1800s when iron ore and coal were unearthed beneath the ridges. By 1930, it had become a patchwork of company towns, coal camps, and remote family homesteads clinging to the mountainsides like stubborn moss. Railroad tracks cut through the valley like veins, linking Big Stone Gap to East Stone Gap and the smaller settlements beyond. Men worked the mines 6 days a week, surfacing from the earth with blackened faces and lungs slowly filling with coal dust. Women tended gardens, put up food for winter, and raised children in clapboard houses that barely kept the cold at bay. Nestled in one of these hollers, roughly 3 miles from the center of town, stood the Hood homestead. It was a modest 2-story wooden farmhouse with a tin roof that sang when rain fell. The porch drooped slightly at one end, but William Hood had built it with his own 2 hands 20 years before, and it had sheltered his family through many a hard winter. William Hood was known across Wise County as a man of unshakable integrity. At 48, he stood 6 feet tall with broad shoulders shaped by years of farm work. His face was weathered and deeply lined, but his eyes, pale blue like a winter sky, carried a gentleness that contradicted his imposing build. He wore the same clothes nearly every day, denim overalls, a flannel shirt patched at the elbows, and heavy work boots caked in red Virginia clay. But William was more than a farmer. He ran a small general store along the main road where miners and their families could purchase flour, sugar, beans, and other essentials. During these desperate times, when men were laid off from the mines or broken by cave-ins, William did something remarkable. He extended credit without interest, sometimes for months on end. "A man's got to eat and his children got to have shoes," William would say, brushing off any concerns about unpaid debts. "The Lord will provide." On Saturday mornings, he would load sacks of flour, beans, and sugar into the bed of his truck and drive out to the homes of families whose breadwinners were out of work or bedridden with black lung. He never asked for repayment. Never mentioned it. It was simply what a Christian man did for his neighbors. His wife, Bertha Hood, was a quiet woman with soft features and hands roughened by endless labor. She was 42, her dark hair beginning to streak with gray, kept pinned back in a tight bun. Martha rarely spoke unless spoken to, but her presence held the household together like mortar between bricks. She cooked, cleaned, mended clothes, and guided the children with a firm but loving hand. The Hood children numbered 3. James, the eldest at 17, was already pulling part-time shifts in the mines to help support the family. He had his father's build and his mother's quiet nature. Then came Bertha, 15 years old and the only daughter. And finally young Samuel, just 12, who passed his days helping with farm chores and dreaming of the day he'd be old enough to leave the mountains behind. Bertha and Hood was the light of her father's life. That autumn she was 15 years old, with long chestnut brown hair that fell past her shoulders in soft waves. Her eyes matched her father's, that same pale blue, set in a delicate face with high cheekbones and a small upturned nose. She stood about 5'4", slim but strong from years of farm work. When she smiled, which was often, dimples appeared in both cheeks and her whole face seemed to light up. Unlike many girls her age in the mountains, Bertha attended East Stone Gap High School without fail. Education mattered deeply to William Hood, even if it meant his daughter had to walk 3 miles each way along the railroad tracks to get there. Bertha was a dedicated student, earning high marks in English and history. Her teachers often commented on her sharp mind and her gentle, respectful manner. "She's got a good head on her shoulders, that girl," her teacher, Miss Eleanor Pritchard, would say. "She'll make something of herself." But what truly set Bertha apart was her kindness. She was known throughout the community for lending a hand to neighbors, looking after younger children, and never uttering an unkind word about anyone. At the Free Will Baptist Church, about 2 miles from the Hood homestead, Bertha sang in the choir, her clear soprano rising above the rest during Sunday services. The Hood family attended church faithfully every Sunday morning. They would dress in their best clothes, which weren't much, but were clean and pressed, and walk together down the dirt road to the small white clapboard church with its tall steeple and hand-carved wooden cross. William served as a deacon and Martha helped organize church socials and potluck dinners. In the tight-knit community of Wildcat Valley and the surrounding hollers, everyone knew everyone. Families had worked the same land for generations, their histories woven together through marriages, feuds, and shared hardships. Reputation mattered. Honor mattered. And when a man gave his word, it was as binding as any written contract. Life moved in familiar rhythms. Planting in spring, harvesting in fall, church on Sundays, and Saturday nights when young people would gather at someone's house for music and dancing. Fiddles, banjos, and guitars would fill the mountain air with old-time tunes passed down through the generations. Bertha attended these gatherings from time to time, though William kept a watchful eye over his daughter. She was reaching the age when young men would start coming around, and William was protective, perhaps overly so. He knew the boys in these mountains. Many were decent, hard-working souls, but others had hot tempers stoked by moonshine and pride. By November 1930, Bertha had drawn the attention of several young men in the area. She was beautiful, kind, and from a well-respected family, a prized catch in a community where eligible young women were scarce. But Bertha had no interest in courtship. She was fixed on her studies and her duties at home. 2 boys, however, had grown particularly persistent, Roy Roynes and Shorty Hopkins. Roy Roynes was 15 years old, the same age as Bertha. He lived with his father, Frank Roynes, on a small farm in Wildcat Valley, about 2 miles from the Hood place. Roy was a thin boy, barely 5'7", with shaggy dark hair falling into his eyes and a narrow, angular face. His brown eyes carried an intensity that some found unsettling. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it never reached his eyes. Roy's mother had died in childbirth when he was 8 years old, and the loss had marked him. His father, Frank, was a coal miner with a drinking problem and a short temper. Roy had grown up in a household defined by violence and neglect, learning early that the world was cruel and unforgiving. At school, Roy was known as a loner. He sat in the back, rarely joined in, and got into fights over the slightest perceived slight. His temper was notorious, quick to ignite and slow to cool. Teachers gave him a wide berth, and other students learned not to provoke him. But around Bertha Hood, something in Roy shifted. He softened. He smiled. He tried to talk to her, walking beside her on the way home from school and offering to carry her books. Bertha was polite but kept her distance, uneasy with his intensity. "I appreciate your kindness, Roy, but I can manage," she would say, pulling her books a little closer. Roy didn't handle rejection well. Shorty Hopkins, real name Howard, but everyone called him Shorty on account of his barely 5'5" frame, was also 15. He lived with his family on a larger, more prosperous farm on the far side of Wildcat Valley. Unlike Roy, Shorty came from a well-regarded family. His father, Thomas Hopkins, was a successful landowner who also ran a small sawmill. By Appalachian standards, the Hopkins family had money, and they weren't shy about it. Shorty was stocky and muscular with sandy blonde hair cut short and a round, freckled face. He had a loud, boisterous personality and was popular among his peers. He played baseball, showed up to every social gathering, and was known for his quick wit and easy laughter. But Shorty had a darker streak. He was possessive and jealous, particularly when it came to girls he fancied. And he had set his sights squarely on Bertha Hood. The tension between Roy Roynes and Shorty Hopkins over Bertha had been building for months. In late October 1930, it finally came to a head. It was a Thursday afternoon after school. Bertha was making her way home along the railroad tracks, her usual route, when Shorty caught up with her. He'd already taken her books before she could object and was chatting away about the upcoming church social. "You going to be there Saturday night, Bertha?" "There's going to be dancing and everything," Shorty said, flashing his best smile. "I expect so," Bertha replied politely, though her tone was cool. "Well, I was thinking maybe you'd save a dance for me," Shorty pressed. Before Bertha could answer, Roy Roynes stepped out from the tree beside the tracks, his face flushed, his jaw tight. "She ain't dancing with you, Hopkins," Roy said, his voice low and dangerous. Shorty turned, his expression shifting from friendly to confrontational. "And who are you to say what she does or doesn't do, Roynes?" "Leave her alone," Roy warned. "Or what?" Shorty stepped closer, chest puffed out. "You think you're tough, you scrawny." The first punch landed fast. Roy swung wildly, catching Shorty on the jaw. Shorty stumbled back, then charged, tackling Roy to the ground. The two boys rolled in the dirt beside the tracks, fists flying, blood quickly appearing from split lips and noses. "Stop it. Stop it right now." Bertha screamed, but they ignored her. Students who had been walking home gathered around, some cheering, others trying to pull the boys apart. Finally, two older boys managed to separate them. Both Roy and Shorty were breathing hard, faces bruised and bloodied. "You stay away from her," Roy hissed, spitting blood. "She ain't yours, Roynes," Shorty shot back. Bertha was shaking, tears running down her face. "I don't belong to either of you. Leave me alone." She snatched her books from the dirt and ran, her footsteps echoing across the wooden railroad ties. That evening, Bertha told her father what had happened. William Hood's face darkened with anger. "Those boys have no right to fight over you like your property," he said, his voice tight. "I'll speak to their fathers." "Please, Papa, don't make it worse," Bertha pleaded. William looked at his daughter, his precious girl, and saw the fear in her eyes. He softened slightly, resting a large, calloused hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle it quietly," he promised. "But this stops now." Over the next few days, William Hood spoke to both Frank Roynes and Thomas Hopkins. Both men assured him their sons would keep away from Bertha. Frank Roynes was apologetic. Thomas Hopkins was defensive but ultimately agreed. For a brief while, it seemed the matter had been laid to rest. But on the evening of Saturday, November 1, 1930, Bertha Hood was spotted walking near the railroad tracks with both Roy Roynes and Shorty Hopkins. Witnesses would later say the three of them appeared to be arguing, their voices raised, though no one could make out the words. By Sunday morning, everything would change. November 2, 1930 broke cold and gray. Frost blanketed the ground and thick fog clung to the mountains. The Hood family rose early, as they always did on Sundays, to prepare for church. Martha put together a simple breakfast of biscuits, gravy, and fried eggs. The family ate together at the worn kitchen table, saying grace before the meal. Conversation was sparse. William was worn out from a long week at the store, and the children were still half asleep. After breakfast, they dressed in their Sunday clothes. For Bertha, that meant a modest navy blue dress with a white collar, cotton stockings, and her only pair of good shoes, black leather with small heels that her mother had bought her the previous Christmas. The family walked to church together, their breath hanging in the cold morning air. The service was much like any other. Hymns, prayer, a sermon from Reverend Clayton on faith in hard times. Bertha sang in the choir, her voice clear and strong. After the service, the congregation lingered outside, talking and making plans for the coming Thanksgiving. William chatted with other men about work and weather. Martha visited with the women about recipes and children. By early afternoon, the Hood family headed home. Martha prepared a simple Sunday dinner of chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. They ate unhurriedly, making the most of the one day of the week when work could wait. As evening came on, the sky darkened early, heavy clouds pressing in with the promise of rain. Bertha helped her mother with the dishes while her brothers split wood for the stove. Around 6:30, Bertha announced she was going to the evening prayer meeting at church. "It's getting dark, honey," Martha said, worry in her voice. "I'll be fine, Mama. It's only 2 miles and I know the way," Bertha replied. "Take a lantern," William said firmly. "Yes, Papa." Bertha pulled on her heavy wool coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and lifted the kerosene lantern from beside the door. She kissed her mother on the cheek and waved to her father. "I'll be home by 9, she called out. And with that, Bertha had stepped out into the gathering dark, making her way down the dirt path toward the railroad tracks. Her lantern bobbed like a firefly as she vanished into the mist. She would never reach the church. She would never come home again. The evening prayer meeting at the Free Will Baptist Church was set to begin at 7 o'clock. By 10 to 7, families had started arriving, their lanterns and flashlights carving small pools of light out of the darkness. The church itself glowed warmly from within, its windows throwing yellow rectangles onto the frost-covered ground. Reverend Clayton stood at the door greeting his parishioners as they came in. He was a tall, thin man in his late 50s, white-haired and kind-faced, weathered by years of mountain living. He shook hands, exchanged pleasantries, and welcomed everyone inside. By 7:15, the service was underway. The small congregation, perhaps 30 people, sang hymns and bowed their heads as the Reverend led them in prayer. But something was off. Reverend Clayton kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting someone. When the service concluded around 8:30, he made his way to Martha Hood's sister, Elizabeth, who had come with her family. "I didn't see Bertha tonight," Reverend Clayton said. "Is she feeling poorly?" Elizabeth's face went white. "Bertha left home around 6:30 to come here. She should have arrived by 7 at the latest." A cold dread settled over them both. "Maybe she changed her mind and went home," Reverend Clayton offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Bertha wouldn't do that. If she said she was coming, she'd come," Elizabeth said, her voice rising with panic. Word spread quickly through those still gathered. Within minutes, several men had volunteered to search the path between the Hood homestead and the church. They grabbed lanterns and flashlights and headed out into the night, calling Bertha's name into the darkness. Back at the Hood homestead, William and Martha had already begun to worry. It was past 9 and Bertha hadn't come home. William paced the porch, jaw clenched, hands balled into fists. "She should be home by now," he muttered. "Maybe the service ran late," Martha offered weakly, though she didn't believe it. At 9:30, Elizabeth and her husband arrived at the Hood house, breathless and frightened. "Bertha never made it to church," Elizabeth burst out. "We've been searching along the tracks but there's no sign of her." William had felt his blood turn to ice. Without a word, he grabbed his coat, his rifle, and the brightest lantern in the house. "James, Samuel, come with me," he ordered. "We're finding your sister." Martha crumpled into a chair, tears pouring down her face. "Please, Lord, let her be safe." The search went out in earnest. William Hood, his 2 sons, Elizabeth's husband, and half a dozen men from the church fanned out along the railroad tracks and into the surrounding woods. They called Bertha's name until their voices were raw. Lanterns swung back and forth, throwing eerie shadows through the trees. The temperature had dropped and a light rain had begun to fall, making the search even more treacherous. The railroad tracks were slick and the ground beside them was muddy and uneven. William's mind churned with terrible possibilities. Had she fallen and hurt herself? Had a wild animal crossed her path? The mountains were home to black bears, though they typically avoided people. Or had something worse happened? He forced the thought away and kept moving, focused on one thing only: finding his daughter. Around 11, one search party, 3 men led by a local coal miner named Henry Walsh, made a discovery. About a quarter-mile from the railroad crossing near Wildcat Creek, just off the tracks in a shallow ditch choked with brush, Henry's lantern fell on something that stopped his heart cold. A shoe. A black leather shoe with a small heel. "Over here!" Henry shouted, his voice cracking. The other men rushed over, their lanterns converging on the spot. And there, half hidden by tall grass and brambles, they found her. Bertha Hood lay on her back, arms at her sides, her face turned slightly toward the sky. Her navy blue dress was soaked with rain and mud. Her eyes were closed, and her skin was deathly pale in the lantern light. But what made the men recoil in horror was the dark stain spreading across the front of her dress, just above her heart. Blood. "Dear God," Henry whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. He pressed trembling fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. "She's gone," he said, his voice barely a sound. One of the other men ran to find William Hood. William was searching along the creek bank when he heard the shouts. He turned and saw a figure running toward him through the darkness. Mr. Hood, we found her." William's heart leapt, but the look on the man's face crushed it instantly. "Is she?" William couldn't finish. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hood. She's dead." William Hood let out a sound that was half roar, half sob. It tore through the mountains, raw and primal, filled with a grief so vast it seemed to shake the earth itself. He ran toward the gathered lanterns, his boots sliding in the mud. When he reached the spot, the men stepped aside to let him through. William fell to his knees beside his daughter's body. He gathered her into his arms, holding her against his chest as he had when she was small. Her body was cold and stiff. "Bertha," he sobbed. "My baby girl. My sweet baby girl." The men stood in silence, tears running down their weathered faces. Several removed their hats and bowed their heads in prayer. After a long while, Henry Walsh gently placed a hand on William's shoulder. "Mr. Hood, we need to get the sheriff. This wasn't an accident. Somebody shot her." William looked up, his face twisted with anguish. Who would do this to my girl?" "I don't know, sir. But we're going to find out." 2 men were sent to fetch Sheriff Amos Bentley from Wise while the others carefully carried Bertha's body back to the Hood homestead. William walked alongside them, one hand resting on his daughter's shoulder, unwilling to let go. When they came up the path toward the house, Bertha Hood saw them coming and knew instantly. She let out a high, keening wail that cut through the night and collapsed on the porch. Neighbors rushed to hold her as she sobbed. They laid Bertha's body on the dining room table, covering her with a clean white sheet. Martha sat beside her daughter, clutching her cold hand, rocking back and forth, whispering prayers. William stood at the window, staring into the darkness, his jaw so tightly clenched it ached. His grief was already hardening into something else. Rage. Someone had murdered his daughter, and he would find out who. Sheriff Amos Bentley arrived at the Hood homestead around 2 in the morning, accompanied by his deputy, Carl Porter, and Dr. Thomas Mullins, the county coroner. Sheriff Bentley was a stocky man in his early 50s with graying hair and a thick mustache. He'd been sheriff of Wise County for 12 years and had seen his share of violence, bar fights, domestic disputes, the occasional killing over moonshine or land. But the murder of a 15-year-old girl unsettled even his hardened composure. Dr. Mullins examined Bertha's body while the sheriff questioned William Hood and the men who had found her. "Tell me everything," Sheriff Bentley said, pulling out a small notebook. William recounted the day, the church service, the Sunday dinner, Bertha leaving for the evening prayer meeting. His voice was hollow and mechanical, as though reciting facts was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. "Did she have any enemies? Anyone who might want to harm her?" "No," William said immediately. "Everyone loved Bertha. She was a good girl. She never caused trouble." Then he paused, his expression shifting. "Wait," he said slowly. "There were two boys. They'd been fighting over her. Just last week they got into a fistfight after school." Sheriff Bentley looked up from his notebook. "What boys?" "Roy Roynes and Shorty Hopkins. Both from Wildcat Valley." The sheriff knew both families. The Royneses were poor, scraping by on a small farm. The Hopkins family was more prosperous, with standing in the community. "What happened between them?" William described the fight, the warnings he'd given to both fathers, and the witnesses who had spotted Bertha with both boys the previous evening. Sheriff Bentley made notes, his expression grim. "I'll need to speak with both of them." Dr. Mullins finished his examination and pulled the sheriff aside. "Single gunshot wound directly to the heart. Entry wound is small, likely a .22 or .32 caliber. No exit wound. The bullet is still inside. Death would have been almost instantaneous. No signs of struggle or anything else. Time of death. Based on body temperature and rigor mortis, I'd put it between 6:30 and 7:30 last evening." Sheriff Bentley turned back to William. "Mr. Hood, I know this is an unbearable time, but I need you to trust me. I will find who did this." William looked at the sheriff, his pale blue eyes now cold and hard as steel. "You find them, Sheriff. You find them, or I will." As dawn broke over the Cumberland Mountains on November 3, 1930, word of Bertha Hood's murder swept through Wise County like a brush fire. Neighbors streamed to the Hood homestead with food, flowers, and condolences. Women from the church came to help Martha prepare Bertha's body. Men gathered on the porch, speaking in low, angry voices. The community was in shock. Murders did happen in Appalachia, usually over moonshine, land, or old feuds. But the killing of an innocent young girl was something else entirely. It violated every code of honor and decency that mountain people held dear. By mid-morning, Sheriff Bentley and Deputy Porter were riding out to the Roynes farm. They found Roy still in bed, despite it being nearly 10 in the morning. Frank Roynes answered the door bleary-eyed and reeking of alcohol. "Sheriff," he said, surprised. "What brings you out here?" "I need to speak with your boy, Frank. It's important." "What's this about?" "Bertha Hood was murdered last night. I need to ask Roy some questions." Frank's face went pale. "Roy didn't have nothing to do with that." "Then he won't mind answering a few questions." Frank reluctantly called his son. Roy appeared a few minutes later in rumpled clothes, his dark hair going every direction. His eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, and he looked nervous. "Roy, where were you last night between 6:30 and 8? Sheriff Bentley asked. I was home," Roy stammered. "Anyone who can verify that?" Roy glanced at his father. "Pa, tell him he was here," Roy said. "Been here since supper time," Frank said quickly. The sheriff made notes, watching Roy carefully. The boy wouldn't meet his eyes. "Did you see Bertha Hood at all yesterday?" the sheriff pressed. "No," Roy said too quickly. "That's strange. Several people say they saw you talking to her near the railroad tracks Saturday evening." Roy's face flushed. I might have seen her. I don't remember." "You don't remember?" "Look, I talked to her for a minute maybe. But that's all. I didn't do nothing to her." The sheriff could see the boy was hiding something, but he didn't have enough to arrest him. Not yet. "Don't leave town, Roy," the sheriff warned. "I'll be back with more questions." Next, Sheriff Bentley called on the Hopkins farm. It was a far more prosperous operation, with a substantial farmhouse, several outbuildings, and well-kept fencing. Thomas Hopkins met the sheriff at the door, his expression guarded. "Sheriff Bentley," he said formally. "How can I help you?" "I need to speak with your son, Shorty." "What's this regarding?" "Bertha Hood was murdered last night." Thomas Hopkins's face registered genuine shock. "Good Lord, that's terrible. But what does that have to do with my boy?" "I understand he and Roy Roynes had both been competing for her attention. I need to ask him some questions." Thomas's expression hardened. "My son had nothing to do with this. The Roynes boy, on the other hand, has a violent temper. If you're looking for a killer, I'd start there." "I'll be the judge of that," Sheriff Bentley said evenly. "Now, may I speak with Shorty?" Shorty Hopkins came out looking confident and composed, nothing like Roy's nervous fidgeting. "Sheriff," he said, extending his hand. "Shorty, where were you last night between 6:30 and 8? "I was here having supper with my family. My parents and both my sisters can vouch for that." "Did you see Bertha Hood yesterday?" "No, sir. Last time I saw her was at school on Friday." "What about Saturday evening? Were you near the railroad tracks?" Shorty hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "No, sir. I was home all day Saturday." The sheriff made his notes, suspicion growing. Both boys had family alibis, which meant very little in a community where loyalty ran deep. Over the following days, Sheriff Bentley conducted a thorough investigation. He questioned dozens of witnesses, combed the area where Bertha's body had been found, and worked to piece together what had happened that Sunday evening. What he uncovered painted a troubling picture. Multiple witnesses confirmed that on Saturday evening, November 1st, Bertha Hood had been seen near the railroad tracks with both Roy Roynes and Shorty Hopkins, the three of them arguing, though no one could catch the words. One witness, an elderly woman named Mrs. Calloway who lived close to the tracks, reported hearing raised voices and then later that evening, a single gunshot. She had assumed it was someone hunting or scaring off animals and hadn't thought anything of it. The sheriff also discovered that Roy Roynes owned a .32 caliber pistol, something Roy initially denied but eventually admitted when pressed. "I use it for hunting small game," Roy insisted. "But I didn't shoot Bertha." "Where is the pistol now?" It's gone. I lost it a few days ago." The sheriff didn't believe him. Meanwhile, the community was growing restless. At the general store, at church, in homes across Wise County, people talked of little else. Most were convinced that Roy Roynes, Shorty Hopkins, or both, were responsible for Bertha's death. William Hood heard all the talk, and with each day that passed without an arrest, his fury deepened. He was a patient man, a godly man, but the murder of his innocent daughter had stirred something dark and primal in him. On the morning of November 5th, 3 days after Bertha's death, William Hood decided he could no longer wait on the law. He rose before dawn, dressed warmly, and loaded his .45 caliber revolver, the one he kept for protection. He climbed into his truck and drove 3 miles to the Roynes farm. The sun was just beginning to climb, painting the mountains in shades of pink and gold. Frost covered everything, glittering in the early light. The world looked peaceful, oblivious to the violence that had shattered so many lives. William parked his truck and walked to the Royns' house. He hammered on the door hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Royns, get out here." Frank Royns stumbled to the door, still half asleep. When he saw William Hood standing there, pistol in hand, his eyes went wide. "Get your boy now," William said, his voice cold and flat. "Mr. Hood, please." "My boy didn't." Frank disappeared inside and came back a minute later with Roy, who looked terrified. The boy was pale, his hands shaking. William grabbed Roy by the arm, his grip like iron. "You're coming with me." "Where are you taking him?" Frank protested. "To the sheriff. This boy knows what happened to my daughter, and he's going to tell the truth." "Mr. Royns, I'm sorry, but I'm taking your boy with me, and we'll let him tell his story to the law," William said, cocking his pistol for emphasis. Frank Royns looked at the gun, then at William's cold, steady eyes, and made his decision. He stepped aside. "Don't hurt him," Frank whispered. "That depends on what he tells me," William replied. And with that, William Hood marched 15-year-old Roy Royns 3 miles to the Wise County Sheriff's office at gunpoint. The sun was fully up by the time William Hood and Roy Royns reached the sheriff's office in Wise. The main street was coming alive with the morning's business, shopkeepers opening up, farmers rolling in with loaded wagons, children heading to school. But when people caught sight of William Hood, a respected man, a church deacon, marching a terrified teenage boy at gunpoint, everything stopped. People froze where they stood, staring in disbelief. William kicked open the door to the sheriff's office and shoved Roy inside ahead of him. Sheriff Bentley looked up from his desk, his hand moving instinctively toward his holstered weapon. "William, what in God's name are you doing?" the sheriff demanded. "This boy knows what happened to Bertha," William said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "And he's going to tell you everything." Roy stood shaking, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't do it. I swear, Mr. Hood, I didn't kill her." "Then tell the truth," William roared. Sheriff Bentley moved quickly between the two of them, gently but firmly taking the pistol from William's hand. "William, I understand your pain, but you cannot take the law into your own hands," the sheriff said quietly. William's shoulders sagged, the adrenaline rushing out of him all at once. He looked older, more broken than he had just moments before. "Someone killed my baby girl," William whispered. "Someone took her from us, and I need to know who." "And we will find out," Sheriff Bentley assured him. "But we have to do this the right way." The sheriff turned to Roy. "Sit down, son. We're going to talk." Over the next 2 hours, Roy Royns told his story. It shifted repeatedly. Details changed. Contradictions piled up. At first he insisted he'd been home all Sunday evening. Then he admitted he'd been near the railroad tracks, but claimed he hadn't seen Bertha. Finally, under relentless questioning, he broke. "I saw her," Roy sobbed. "I saw her walking toward the church. But I didn't hurt her. I swear." "What did you do when you saw her?" I called out to her. I wanted to talk to her, but she was upset. She told me to leave her alone." "And then what?" Roy hesitated, eyes darting around the room. "Shorty was there, too. He came out of the woods. He'd been following her." This was the first time Shorty Hopkins had been directly placed at the scene. "Bail for murder is not negotiable," Sheriff Bentley said. "He hasn't been charged with murder," the attorney countered. "Only suspicion. Under Virginia law, he's entitled to reasonable bail." Reluctantly, the sheriff had no choice but to release both boys once bail was posted. As a condition of release, Roy and Shorty were placed under house arrest and forbidden from leaving their properties. The Roynes family didn't have the same resources as the Hopkinses, but they scraped together enough to retain a modest attorney, a young lawyer from Bristol named Marcus Webb, who had built a reputation for defending those without means. Meanwhile, the Hood family prepared to bury their daughter. Bertha's funeral was held on November 6, 1930, at the Free Will Baptist Church. The small building couldn't hold everyone who came to pay their respects. People stood outside in the cold, hats in hand, heads bowed. The simple wooden coffin sat at the front of the church, surrounded by wildflowers gathered from the last blooms of autumn. Bertha lay inside in her navy blue dress, cleaned and mended where the bullet had torn through, her hands folded across her chest. Martha Hood sat in the front pew, held up on one side by her sister Elizabeth and on the other by her son James. She was dressed in black and looked as though she had aged 10 years in less than a week. Her face was drawn and pale, her eyes hollow from sleepless nights. William Hood sat beside her, rigid and silent. He stared at his daughter's coffin, jaw clenched, hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles went white. He hadn't cried since the night they found Bertha. His grief had calcified into something cold and unyielding. Reverend Clayton delivered the eulogy, his voice giving way more than once. Bertha and Hood was a light in this community, he said. She was kind, generous, faithful, and full of promise. Her death is a tragedy that cuts to the very heart of who we are as a people. We ask ourselves how such evil could touch one so innocent. We have no answers. Only questions and pain. He paused, looking out over the sea of grieving faces. But we must also remember that Bertha is not truly gone. She is with the Lord now, free from pain, free from the cruelty of this world. And one day, when our own time comes, we will see her again. After the service, the congregation followed the coffin up the hillside to the small cemetery behind the church. The grave had been dug that morning, the red Virginia clay piled alongside it. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, Martha Hood let out a wail of such raw grief it seemed to split the sky. William stood motionless, his face like stone, as shovelfuls of earth fell onto his daughter's coffin, each one landing like a hammer blow. When it was over and the mourners had slowly made their way home, the Hood family stood alone at the graveside. William knelt beside the fresh mound of earth and pressed his hand to it. "I promise you, Bertha," he whispered. "I will find who did this. And they will pay." Over the weeks that followed, the investigation pressed on, though progress was slow. Both Roy and Shorty held firm to their innocence, and without a murder weapon or a confession, the case remained largely circumstantial. But tensions in Wise County were reaching a breaking point. Rumors ran wild. Some said Roy had been so consumed by Bertha that he'd killed her in a fit of jealous rage when she turned him away once more. Others claimed Shorty had shot her by accident and was covering it up. Still others whispered that both boys had planned it together. Families chose sides. The Hoods had the sympathy of most of the community, but the Hopkins family had money and influence, and they used both. Thomas Hopkins conducted what amounted to a public relations campaign, insisting on Shorty's innocence at every opportunity and directing blame squarely at Roy Roynes. "It's that Roynes boy," Thomas told anyone who would listen. "He's got a violent temper. Everyone knows it. My son would never hurt anyone." The Roynes family, lacking the resources or standing to fight back, could do little but protest Roy's innocence and hope the truth would surface on its own. As Christmas came and went, the case seemed to stall. Defense attorneys filed motion after motion, pushing the trial further back. Commonwealth Attorney Douglas Hale, leading the prosecution, struggled to build a case without solid physical evidence. Then, in January 1931, a break came from an unexpected direction. A 16-year-old named Billy Thompson walked into the Wise County Sheriff's office and said he had information that could crack the case wide open. "I know what happened that night," Billy told Sheriff Bentley. "And I can't keep quiet no more." What Billy had to say was explosive. He claimed that on the evening of November 2nd, he had been out hunting rabbits in the woods near the railroad tracks when he heard voices. He recognized them immediately as Roy, Shorty, and Bertha. They were arguing something fierce, Billy said. Bertha was telling them both to leave her alone, that she wasn't interested in neither of them. Roy was getting angry, saying things like, "If I can't have you, nobody can." And Shorty was trying to calm him down. "What happened next?" Sheriff Bentley asked. "I heard Bertha say she was going to tell her father about them bothering her. She'd had enough. And then I heard a gunshot." Billy's hands trembled as he went on. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do. I hid behind a tree and watched. I saw Roy standing there with a pistol in his hand, looking down at something on the ground. Shorty was backing away with his hands up, saying, 'What did you do? What did you do?' And then Roy told Shorty that if he said a word, he'd kill him, too. And Shorty ran. Just took off. And Roy, he dragged Bertha's body off the tracks into the ditch. Then he ran, too." "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" the sheriff demanded. "I was scared," Billy admitted, tears in his eyes. "Roy threatened people. Everyone knows that. I thought he might come after me or my family. But I can't sleep anymore. I see her face every time I close my eyes. She deserves justice." This testimony changed everything. On January 15, 1931, Roy Roynes was formally charged with first-degree murder. Shorty Hopkins was charged as an accessory after the fact for failing to report the crime. But before the trial could begin, something happened that nearly brought the whole thing crashing down. On a bitter February night, a group of armed men, vigilantes from the mountains, friends, and kin of the Hood family, assembled at a crossroads outside Wise. There were about 20 of them, carrying Winchester rifles and Colt pistols, their faces set with cold determination. "The law ain't doing its job," one of them said. "That boy killed Bertha Hood, and he's going to pay." Their plan was straightforward. Ride to the Roynes and Hopkins homes, drag both boys out, and administer frontier justice. A hanging. But Sheriff Bentley had gotten wind of it. He and his deputies intercepted the vigilantes before they could reach either property. "You men need to go home," the sheriff said, his hand resting on his holster. "That boy murdered an innocent girl," one of the men shot back. "And he's sitting comfortable in his house while Bertha Hood lies cold in the ground." "I understand your anger," the sheriff said steadily. "But we have a trial scheduled. Justice will be served, and it will be served lawfully. And what if he gets off? What if some fancy lawyer gets him acquitted? Then we deal with that when and if it happens," Sheriff Bentley replied. "But I will not allow mob justice in my county. Now go home, before I arrest every one of you for conspiracy to commit murder." The men grumbled, but eventually they turned and dispersed. The crisis was averted. But the sheriff knew the clock was running. The trial had to happen soon, before the community tore itself to pieces. The trial was set for April 16, 1931. That day broke clear and warm, the first real taste of spring in the Cumberland Mountains. But the beauty of the morning was lost on the hundreds of people converging on the Wise County Courthouse. The courthouse was a handsome brick building from 1895, with a distinctive balustrade running along the flat roofline and a two-story addition put up in 1920. It sat at the center of Wise, surrounded by a lawn now trampled beneath an enormous crowd. People had come from all corners of Wise County and beyond, from Big Stone Gap, East Stone Gap, Norton, and the remote hollows in between. They arrived on horseback, in wagons, in the few automobiles that wealthier families could afford. By 8:30 in the morning, the courthouse steps were packed and the lawn was thick with spectators. The courtroom on the second floor could seat perhaps 100 people, but easily twice that number tried to squeeze inside. Bailiffs struggled to hold back the crowd, eventually closing the doors and stationing deputies outside. "This is the biggest crowd I've ever seen for a trial," Judge Harold Morrison remarked to his clerk as he prepared to enter. Judge Morrison was 62, a distinguished-looking man with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. He had presided over the Wise County Circuit Court for 20 years and was known for his fairness and his no-nonsense command of the room. The atmosphere inside the courtroom crackled with tension. On one side sat the Hood family, William, Martha, James, and Samuel, along with extended relatives and supporters. William wore his only suit, black wool worn at the elbows, and sat perfectly upright, his face an impassive mask. Across the way sat Frank Roynes, looking haggard and beaten. He couldn't afford a new suit, so he wore clean work clothes and a borrowed tie. Roy sat beside him at the defense table in clothes his attorney had provided. The boy looked even younger than his 15 years, pale and small, dark circles under his eyes. Behind them sat the Hopkins family. Thomas and his wife Grace, along with Shorty. Despite facing the lesser charge of accessory, the Hopkins family had spared nothing on his defense. Thomas sat with his arms folded, his face fixed in an expression of righteous indignation. The prosecution was led by Commonwealth Attorney Douglas Hale, a stern man in his late 40s with a reputation for aggressive courtroom tactics, assisted by 2 junior prosecutors. For the defense, Roy had Marcus Webb, the young Bristol attorney. Webb was only 30, sandy-haired and earnest-faced. He lacked Hale's experience but was sharp and deeply committed to defending those who had nothing. Judge Morrison entered and the room rose. "All rise. The Circuit Court of Wise County is now in session. The Honorable Judge Harold Morrison presiding." "Be seated," Judge Morrison said, settling in behind the bench. He looked out over the packed courtroom, his expression grave. "This is a murder trial. We are here to determine the guilt or innocence of the defendant, Roy Roynes, in the death of Bertha and Hood. This court will tolerate no outbursts, no disruptions. Anyone who cannot conduct themselves appropriately will be removed. Is that understood?" A murmur of assent moved through the crowd. "Very well. Mr. Hale, you may present the Commonwealth's case." Douglas Hale rose and buttoned his jacket. He was a commanding presence, tall and broad-shouldered, with a voice that filled every corner of the room. "May it please the court," he began. On the evening of November 2, 1930, 15-year-old Bertha and had left her family's home to attend a church service. She never arrived. Her body was found later that night, shot through the heart. She was an innocent girl, a beloved daughter, a faithful member of her church, and a promising student. Her murder shocked this community and left a family broken by grief. He paused, letting the silence work. "The Commonwealth will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant, Roy Roynes, committed this heinous crime. We will present witnesses who placed the defendant at the scene. We will show that the defendant had motive, a jealous obsession with the victim. We will demonstrate that he had the means and the opportunity to commit this murder." He gestured toward Roy, who seemed to shrink under the weight of every eye in the room. "Justice for Bertha Hood demands that her killer be held accountable. And that killer is sitting at the defense table." Hale sat down, and Marcus Webb stood for the defense. "Your Honor," Webb began, his voice less commanding than Hale's but steady and sincere. "Roy Roynes is a 15-year-old boy. He is not a monster. He is not a hardened criminal. He is a child who made mistakes, who showed poor judgment, but who did not commit murder." Webb moved to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror in turn. The Commonwealth's case rests on speculation and circumstantial evidence. Yes, Roy knew Bertha Hood. Yes, he admired her. But admiration is not murder. The prosecution would have you believe that because Roy was near the railroad tracks that evening, he must be guilty. But being in the vicinity of a crime is not the same as committing it. He returned to the defense table and placed a hand on Roy's shoulder. Roy Roynes deserves a fair trial built on facts and evidence, not on emotion and prejudice. I ask you to listen carefully to the testimony, to weigh the evidence honestly, and to remember that in this country, a person is innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. With opening statements done, the prosecution began calling witnesses. First to the stand was William Hood. William placed his hand on the Bible, swore his oath, and settled into the witness chair. His large hands gripped the armrests. "Mr. Hood, please tell the court about your daughter, Bertha," Hale said gently. William's voice was steady but strained. "Bertha was my only daughter. She was 15 years old. She was a good girl. Went to church every Sunday, helped her mother, did well in school. She never caused no trouble." Did Bertha have a relationship with the defendant, Roy Roynes? "No, sir. She didn't want nothing to do with him. He and another boy, Shorty Hopkins, had been bothering her. They got into a fight over her just a week before she died." "How did Bertha feel about this attention?" "She was scared. She told me she wanted them to leave her alone." "And what did you do?" "I spoke to both boys' fathers. I told them their sons needed to stay away from my daughter." Hale nodded. "And yet on the night Bertha died, witnesses saw her with both boys near the railroad tracks. Is that correct?" "That's what I've been told," William said, his voice hardening. "Thank you, Mr. Hood. No further questions." Marcus Webb approached for cross-examination, his manner sympathetic. "Mr. Hood, I am deeply sorry for your loss. I can't imagine the pain you and your family have endured." William nodded stiffly. "Mr. Hood, you testified that Bertha didn't want anything to do with Roy or Shorty. But did she ever actually say that Roy threatened her or harmed her in any way?" William hesitated. "She said he made her uncomfortable. But she never said he threatened her. Not in so many words, no." "Is it possible that Roy simply had a teenage crush on Bertha and didn't know how to express it appropriately?" "Objection," Hale said, rising. "Speculation." "Sustained." Webb nodded. No further questions. Next came Martha Hood. She could barely make it to the witness stand on her own, supported on one side by her sister Elizabeth. She wore black and looked as though she'd been hollowed out. Hale questioned her gently, asking about Bertha's character, the events of that Sunday, and the moment her daughter walked out the door. "She kissed my cheek," Martha whispered, tears falling freely. "She said, 'I'll be home by 9, Mama.'" She paused. "And I never saw her alive again." There wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even Judge Morrison had to look away. Marcus Webb declined to cross-examine. There was nothing to be gained from questioning a grieving mother, and doing so would only harden the jury against his client. The prosecution then called Dr. Thomas Mullins, the coroner, who walked the court through his findings. The victim died from a single gunshot wound to the heart, Dr. Mullins explained. The bullet entered just above the left breast and penetrated the heart directly. Death would have been nearly instantaneous. Based on the angle of entry, the shooter was standing approximately 5 to 10 feet away, at roughly the same height as the victim. "What caliber weapon was used?" Hale asked. "Based on the wound and the bullet I extracted, I would estimate a .32 caliber pistol." "And is it true that the defendant owned a .32 caliber pistol?" Objection. Webb was on his feet. That hasn't been established in this testimony. Sustained. Mr. Hale, confine your questions to this witness's expertise. Hale nodded. No further questions. Webb stepped forward for cross-examination. Dr. Mullins, you said the shooter was standing 5 to 10 feet away. Correct. Yes. Could you determine from the wound whether the shooting was intentional or accidental? Dr. Mullins paused. No. The wound itself doesn't indicate intent, only trajectory and impact. So it's possible this could have been an accidental discharge? It's possible. Yes. Thank you, Doctor. The next witness was the one that mattered most. Billy Thompson. Billy was 16, tall and fidgety, his nerves barely contained as he took the stand and was sworn in. Douglas Hale approached with the careful patience of someone who knew exactly what was coming and needed it delivered cleanly. Billy, please tell the court what you witnessed on the evening of November 2, 1930. Billy swallowed hard. I was out hunting rabbits in the woods near the railroad tracks, around 6:30 or so. It was getting dark. I heard voices arguing, so I stopped and listened. Whose voices did you hear? Bertha Hood, Roy Roynes, and Shorty Hopkins. You're certain it was those three individuals? Yes, sir. I've known all of them my whole life. I know their voices. What were they arguing about? Bertha was upset. She was telling Roy and Shorty to leave her alone, that she was tired of them fighting over her like she was some kind of prize. She said she was going to tell her father about them bothering her. And then what happened? Billy's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Roy got angry. He said something like, "If I can't have you, nobody can." And then I heard a gunshot. The courtroom erupted. Judge Morrison's gavel came down hard. Order. I will have order in this courtroom. When the noise settled, Hale continued. What did you do when you heard the gunshot? I was scared. I hid behind a tree. After a minute, I looked out and saw Roy standing there with a pistol in his hand. Shorty was backing away with his hands up, saying, "What did you do?" over and over. And Bertha was on the ground. She wasn't moving. What happened next? Roy told Shorty that if he told anyone, he'd kill him, too. Then Roy dragged Bertha's body off the tracks into the ditch. And then both of them ran off in different directions. And what did you do? I stayed hidden until I was sure they were gone. Then I ran home. I was too scared to tell anyone. Why did you finally come forward? Billy's eyes filled with tears. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face. And I knew it was wrong to stay quiet when a girl had been murdered. She deserves justice. Thank you, Billy. No further questions. The courtroom hummed with conversation. William Hood sat with his fists clenched and tears running down his face. Across the aisle, Roy Roynes had gone deathly pale, shaking his head over and over. Marcus Webb rose for cross-examination, and every eye followed him. Billy, he began, his tone gentle but deliberate. You said you were out hunting rabbits that evening. Yes, sir. What weapon were you carrying? A .22 rifle. Did you fire your weapon at all that evening? Billy hesitated. I might have. I don't really remember. You don't remember? Webb's eyebrows went up. You can recall a conversation that took place in the dark from some distance away in enough detail to quote specific words, but you can't remember whether you fired your own rifle. I was focused on what was happening with them, Billy said, his voice defensive. Billy, isn't it true that you were friends with both Roy and Shorty? We all went to school together. And isn't it also true that you had asked Bertha Hood to a church social just 2 weeks before her death, And she turned you down. Billy's face flushed. That don't mean nothing. Doesn't it? Webb pressed. Isn't it possible that you were the one who was jealous? That you're placing the blame on Roy to draw attention away from yourself? Objection. Hale was on his feet. Counsel is badgering the witness and making unfounded accusations. Your Honor, Webb said calmly, I'm establishing that this witness had his own potential motive and means. The Commonwealth can't have it both ways. Either multiple people had access and motive, which creates reasonable doubt, or we accept that all of this is purely circumstantial. Judge Morrison considered it. Objection overruled. The witness will answer. Billy looked rattled. I didn't do nothing. I'm telling the truth. Are you? Webb asked. Or are you telling a version of events that conveniently puts you in the role of innocent bystander while laying everything at my client's feet? I saw what I saw, Billy insisted. In the dark. From a distance. While hiding behind a tree, Webb said, letting each phrase land separately. Tell me, Billy, how far away were you from where this allegedly took place? I don't know. Maybe 30, 40 feet. And it was dark. Getting dark. Yeah. And you were hiding. Yes. So your view was partially obstructed. I could see well enough. Could you? Webb turned to face the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this witness is asking you to believe that in fading light, from 40 feet away, while concealed behind a tree, he could not only see exactly what occurred but hear specific words clearly enough to quote them. Does that strike you as credible? Objection. Argumentative. Sustained. Mr. Webb, please stay with questions. Webb nodded. Billy, did you tell anyone what you claim to have seen that night? No. I was scared. Not your parents, not the sheriff, not a single person. No. And you waited more than 2 months before coming forward. Like I said, I was scared. Or, Webb suggested, you waited until Roy and Shorty had both been arrested, and then realized you had an opportunity to insert yourself into the investigation by presenting yourself as the eyewitness who could solve everything. That's not true. Isn't it true that you were struggling in school and facing disciplinary action for fighting? What's that got to do with anything? Isn't it true that by becoming a witness in this high-profile case, you went from being a troubled kid that nobody paid much attention to the person everyone suddenly wanted to talk to? Billy's face had gone red, his hands shaking. I'm telling the truth. Roy Roynes killed Bertha Hood. I saw it. No further questions, Webb said, returning to his seat. The damage was done. Whether it was enough to raise reasonable doubt, that was for the jury to decide. The prosecution called several more witnesses. Neighbors testified about Roy's fixation on Bertha. The woman who had heard the gunshot was brought in. Character witnesses spoke to Bertha's reputation and goodness. On the third day of the trial, the prosecution rested. Now it was the defense's turn. Marcus Webb called Roy Roynes to the stand. The courtroom went very still. Roy walked slowly to the witness chair. He looked younger than 15, thin and pale, hands trembling as he laid them on the Bible. Webb approached his client with an encouraging look. Roy, did you kill Bertha Hood? No, sir, Roy said, barely audible. Please speak up for the jury, Judge Morrison instructed. Roy cleared his throat. I didn't kill her. I swear on my mother's grave I didn't do it. Roy, tell the jury what happened on the evening of November 2nd. Roy drew a shaky breath. I was near the railroad tracks. I'd been out hunting and I was heading home. I saw Bertha walking toward the church with her lantern. I called out to her, asked if I could walk with her. What did she say? She said no. She said she wanted to be left alone. She was angry. She told me she was tired of me and Shorty bothering her. What did you do? I told her I was sorry. I said I didn't mean to make her uncomfortable, that I just liked her and wanted to be friends. But she told me to go, so I did. I left. You left her there? Yes, sir. I turned around and went home. Was Shorty Hopkins present? Roy hesitated, glancing across the courtroom at Shorty. He came out of the woods while I was talking to her. He'd been following her. What happened when Shorty appeared? Bertha got even more upset. She started yelling at both of us. And Shorty and I started going at each other. He said I should leave her alone. I told him to mind his own business. And then I left. I walked away. When I went, Bertha was still standing there yelling at Shorty. Did you have a weapon with you? I had my .22 rifle from hunting. But I didn't have any pistol. The prosecution claims you owned a .32 caliber pistol. Is that true? Roy looked down. I did own one. My uncle gave it to me for my birthday last year. But I lost it a few weeks before Bertha died. You lost it? Yes, sir. I think it fell out of my coat pocket when I was out hunting. I looked for it but couldn't find it. Did you report it missing? No, sir. I was afraid my pa would be angry. Webb nodded. Roy, I need to ask you directly. Did you ever threaten Bertha Hood? Did you ever say, if I can't have you, nobody can? No, Roy said with conviction. I never said nothing like that. I wouldn't hurt Bertha. I cared about her. Thank you, Roy. Douglas Hale rose for cross-examination, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. Mr. Roynes, you testified that you cared about Bertha Hood. Is that correct? Yes, sir. Would you say you were obsessed with her? No. I just liked her. But she didn't return your feelings, did she? No. That must have made you angry. I was disappointed. Not angry. Really. Hale moved closer to the stand, towering over Roy. You weren't angry when she rejected you time and again. You weren't angry when she told you, again and again, to leave her alone. I was sad. Not angry. Isn't it true that you have a violent temper? That you've been in multiple fights at school? Roy shifted in his seat. Sometimes. But yes. Isn't it true that just 1 week before Bertha's death, you got into a physical fight with Shorty Hopkins over her? Yes. Hale picked up a piece of paper. I have a statement from your teacher, Miss Pritchard, who says Roy Roynes has a quick temper and becomes violent when provoked. Is Miss Pritchard lying? No. But that doesn't mean I killed Bertha. You testified that you lost your .32 caliber pistol weeks before her death. Isn't it awfully convenient that the murder weapon has never been found? I did lose it. Or did you use it to shoot Bertha Hood and then get rid of it? No. You were seen with Bertha minutes before she was killed. Correct? Yes. But I left before. Yes or no? Yes. And according to witness testimony, you were the last person seen with her before the gunshot was heard. That's not true. Shorty was still there. But you had motive, means, and opportunity, didn't you, Mr. Roynes? Roy was crying now, his voice cracking. I didn't kill her. I swear I didn't. No further questions, Hale said flatly, turning away. Roy was escorted back to the defense table, where he collapsed into his chair and wept. Frank Roynes reached over and gripped his son's shoulder, his own eyes wet. The defense called several character witnesses who testified that Roy, hot-tempered as he was not capable of murder. They called Frank Roynes, who testified his son had been home by 7 that evening, though his admission that he'd been drinking and couldn't be certain of the exact time weakened his account considerably. Finally, the defense called Shorty Hopkins. Shorty took the stand with far more composure than Roy had managed. He was neatly dressed, hair combed, expression serious but calm. Webb walked him through the evening. "I was near the railroad tracks," Shorty admitted. "I saw Bertha walking and I saw Roy talking to her. They were arguing, so I came over to make sure she was all right." "What happened next?" "Bertha was upset. She told both of us to go. Roy got angry and left. I stayed for a moment to apologize to Bertha for the trouble we'd caused her. Then I left as well." "Was Bertha alive when you left?" "Yes, sir. She was walking toward the church." "Did you hear a gunshot?" "No, sir. I was already too far away by then." "Did you see anyone else near the railroad tracks that evening?" Shorty paused, then nodded. "Actually, yes. I saw Billy Thompson in the woods with a rifle. He was watching us." A murmur rolled through the courtroom. "You saw Billy Thompson?" "Yes, sir. I didn't think much of it at the time. Plenty of people hunt in those woods. But looking back now, it seemed strange. He was just standing there, watching." "Thank you, Shorty." Hale's cross-examination was short but pointed. "Mr. Hopkins, isn't it true that your family has hired expensive attorneys to keep you out of trouble?" "My father hired attorneys to represent me." "Yes. And isn't it true that you've been coached on what to say?" Shorty's attorney shot to his feet. "Objection. That's an outrageous accusation with no foundation." Sustained. "Mr. Hale, rephrase." "Mr. Hopkins, you claim you saw Billy Thompson. Why didn't you mention this to the sheriff when you were first questioned?" "I didn't think it was significant." "Or perhaps you're bringing it up now to redirect blame away from yourself and your friend." "That's not true." No further questions. After 5 days of testimony, both sides rested. Closing arguments began on the morning of April 21st. Douglas Hale delivered a forceful summation, calling the jury back to Bertha's innocence, her family's grief, and the weight of circumstantial evidence pointing at Roy Roynes. Roy Roynes had motive, a jealous obsession. He had means, a .32 caliber pistol that vanished without explanation. He had opportunity, he was the last person seen with the victim. The evidence is clear. Justice demands that you find him guilty. Marcus Webb's close was just as passionate. The Commonwealth has built its case on speculation, circumstantial evidence, and the testimony of a questionable witness who may have had his own reasons to harm Bertha Hood. Roy Roynes is a 15-year-old boy who made poor choices, who behaved badly, but who did not commit murder. The prosecution has not proven guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. You must acquit. Judge Morrison instructed the jury, and they retired to deliberate. The wait was agonizing. Hours passed. The crowd outside the courthouse grew restless. Inside, the family sat in rigid silence. Then, after 7 hours, word came that the jury had reached a verdict. Everyone moved back into the courtroom. Judge Morrison took his seat. The jury filed in, faces unreadable. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman, a coal miner named Samuel Preston, rose. We have, Your Honor. What say you? Samuel Preston looked straight at Roy Roynes, and in that moment Roy knew. We find the defendant Roy Roynes guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. The courtroom broke open. William Hood let out a sob of relief, pulling his wife close. Frank Roynes cried out. Roy slumped in his chair, face buried in his hands. Judge Morrison's gavel beat the room back to order. "Roy Roynes," the judge said, his voice grave and deliberate. "You have been found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Bertha and Hood. I hereby sentence you to 25 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary. You will be remanded into custody immediately." Two deputies stepped forward. As they led Roy from the courtroom, he turned and looked back at his father one final time. "I'm sorry, Pa," he whispered. And then he was gone. The verdict sent tremors through Wise County, but not everyone felt settled by it. Second-degree murder meant the jury believed Roy had killed Bertha, but without premeditation. A crime of passion rather than calculated evil. This distinction nagged at those who had followed the case closely. William Hood stood on the courthouse steps afterward, surrounded by neighbors offering condolences and congratulations both. But his face held no satisfaction. Only exhaustion. "Is it over?" Martha asked quietly, gripping his arm. "I don't know," William admitted. "He's been convicted. But Bertha is still gone. Nothing brings her back." As spring turned to summer in 1931, life in Wise County slowly found its footing again, or as much footing as it could after such a loss. The Hood family continued to grieve, making their way to Bertha's grave every Sunday after church. The small headstone they had finally saved up enough to purchase read simply, "Bertha and Hood. 1915 to 1930. Beloved daughter. With the angels." Roy Roynes was transported to the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond to serve his sentence among hardened criminals. In 1931, the prison system made no special accommodations for youth. At 15 years old, Roy would be treated the same as any other inmate. Frank Roynes sold his farm within 6 months, unable to bear the judgment of his neighbors. He moved to West Virginia, where he died 2 years later from complications of alcoholism, never having lived to see what would come next. Shorty Hopkins, charged only as an accessory after the fact, received a suspended sentence after his family's attorneys successfully argued he had been silenced by fear of Roy's threats. The Hopkins family continued to insist, loudly and publicly, that Shorty had been entirely innocent and wrongly dragged into the whole affair. But the story was not finished. In November 1933, exactly 3 years after Bertha's murder, a man appeared at the Wise County Sheriff's office asking to speak with Sheriff Bentley. He was trembling and visibly drunk, glancing over his shoulder as though he expected someone to be following him. "I need to talk to you about the Hood girl," the man said. "About what really happened." The man was Billy Thompson, now 19 years old. Sheriff Bentley, who had been about to leave for the day, stopped and looked at him carefully. Billy had changed in ways that went beyond 3 years of aging. He was thinner, with hollow cheeks and the sunken eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. He had the look of a man being eaten from the inside. "What about Bertha Hood?" the sheriff asked carefully. "I lied," Billy blurted, tears already forming. "I lied at the trial. Roy didn't kill her." Sheriff Bentley felt the ground shift beneath him. "You need to think very carefully about what you're saying, Billy. You testified under oath. If you're telling me you committed perjury—" "I know," Billy sobbed. "I know what I did. And it's been tearing me apart for 3 years. I can't sleep. I can't live with myself anymore. I have to tell the truth. Even if it means I go to prison instead." The sheriff brought Billy inside, shut the door, poured him a cup of coffee, and let him settle. "Start from the beginning," Sheriff Bentley said. "Tell me everything." Billy gripped the cup with both hands and began. "I was out hunting that evening, like I said. And I did see Bertha with Roy and Shorty. They were arguing. But when Roy left and Shorty left, Bertha was still alive. She kept walking toward the church. Then what happened? Billy's hands shook. I followed her. I'd been drinking some moonshine I'd stolen from my daddy's still. I wasn't thinking straight. I'd asked Bertha to the church social a few weeks before and she'd said no. That hurt my pride. And seeing Roy and Shorty fighting over her, when she wouldn't give any of us the time of day, it made me angry. What did you do, Billy? I caught up with her on the tracks. I called out to her, asked her why she thought she was too good for me. She got scared. She told me to leave her alone, said she was going to tell her father. And I got angrier. I grabbed her arm, trying to make her hear me out. Billy's voice broke completely. She pulled away. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, and when she pulled free, it swung around. My finger was on the trigger. I don't even know why. And it went off. The confession settled over the room like a weight. It was an accident. Sheriff Bentley asked. I swear it was, Billy said desperately. I didn't mean to shoot her. But when I saw her fall, saw the blood, I panicked. I knew what people would think. I knew they'd say I murdered her. So I ran. And you let Roy Roynes take the blame. I know, Billy wept. I know what I did. When the sheriff started investigating, when Roy and Shorty got arrested, I thought maybe I'd get away with it altogether. Then the prosecutor came asking if I'd seen anything. I thought if I gave them a story and made Roy look guilty, everyone would believe it and I'd be safe. So I did. You fabricated the entire testimony. Most of it. I did see Roy and Shorty with Bertha earlier. That part was true. But everything about watching Roy shoot her, about him dragging her body, I made all of that up. Sheriff Bentley sat back, his mind moving fast. If Billy was telling the truth, there was an innocent man in the Virginia State Penitentiary, convicted on the strength of fabricated testimony, serving 25 years for a crime he never committed. Why are you coming forward now? The sheriff asked. Because I can't live with it anymore, Billy said simply. Every time I close my eyes I see her face. I hear that gunshot. And I know Roy Roynes is in prison for what I did. It ain't right. I have to make it right. Even if it means I go in his place. Sheriff Bentley called Commonwealth Attorney Douglas Hale that same evening. An emergency meeting was called, with Judge Morrison and Marcus Webb both present. Billy repeated his confession in front of all of them while a court stenographer recorded every word. This is a catastrophic miscarriage of justice, Judge Morrison said, his face drained of color. If this confession is genuine, we've imprisoned an innocent boy. We need to verify his story, Hale said. We can't simply take his word for it. Over the following weeks, investigators went back through all the physical evidence. The bullet that had killed Bertha, preserved as evidence, was subjected to a ballistics comparison with Billy's .22 rifle. The results were devastating. The bullet matched Billy's rifle. Not a .32 caliber pistol, as had been assumed from the start. How did we miss this? Hale demanded. The original analysis was done quickly, the expert explained. The assumption was made based on the wound size. But a .22 caliber bullet fired at close range can produce similar trauma. Nobody thought to test Billy Thompson's rifle because he was a witness, not a suspect. Further investigation turned up additional troubling details. Several people came forward to say Billy had been acting strangely in the days after Bertha's death, drinking heavily, talking to himself, looking over his shoulder constantly. One neighbor recalled Billy asking her, with unusual intensity, what she thought had happened to poor Bertha, in a way that had made the woman deeply uneasy. Most damning of all was evidence that in the weeks following Bertha's death, Billy had been quietly researching the legal penalties for accidental killings versus deliberate murder, asking questions of a courthouse clerk that now took on a very different significance. On January 15, 1934, Judge Morrison issued an order vacating Roy Roynes' conviction. Roy Roynes walked out of the Virginia State Penitentiary on February 3, 1934, after serving 2 years and 10 months for a crime he had not committed. The thin, frightened 15-year-old who had gone in was now an 18-year-old man, reshaped by prison life. His eyes, once capable of softness, now carried a permanent wariness that would never fully leave him. Marcus Webb was waiting for him at the gate, along with a small group of supporters from Wise County who had never stopped believing in his innocence. Frank Roynes was not among them. Roy's father had died the previous year, never knowing his son would be cleared. "I'm sorry this happened to you, Roy," Webb said, taking his hand. "What was done to you was unconscionable." Roy nodded but said nothing. Prison had taught him that words didn't add up to much. The case against Billy Thompson moved quickly. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and perjury. Judge Morrison's sentencing remarks left nothing unsaid. "You allowed an innocent boy to be imprisoned while you walked free," the judge said from the bench, his voice tight with barely contained anger. "You shattered this community's faith in its own justice system. You compounded tragedy with betrayal." Billy Thompson was sentenced to 30 years in the Virginia State Penitentiary. As he was led away in handcuffs, Billy turned and found William Hood in the gallery. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hood," Billy said, his voice giving way. "I'm so sorry for what I did to your daughter. It was an accident. But that don't make it right. I'm sorry." William Hood stared at the young man who had drunkenly killed his daughter and then built a lie around it that swallowed an innocent boy whole. He had wanted to feel something. Relief. Satisfaction. Justice. But all he found was emptiness. Martha Hood had not come. She had stopped leaving the house for anything other than church, her grief having broken something deep inside her. She would die less than 2 years later from pneumonia, though those who knew her best said she had really died the night Bertha did. The full truth of what happened on the evening of November 2, 1930 eventually came into clear focus through Billy's confession and the investigation that followed it. Bertha Hood had indeed crossed paths with Roy Roynes and Shorty Hopkins near the railroad tracks that night. The three had argued, Bertha making it plain she wanted nothing to do with either of them. Both boys had eventually left her alone and gone their separate ways. Billy Thompson, who had been drinking moonshine in the woods while hunting, had watched the entire scene unfold. When Bertha continued on toward the church alone, Billy, fueled by liquor and bruised pride, decided to go after her. He caught up with her on the tracks. He demanded to know why she had rejected him, why she considered herself too good for him. Bertha, frightened and furious, tried to walk away. Billy grabbed her arm. She pulled free sharply. The sudden movement swung his .22 rifle around on its sling. His finger was already on the trigger. The rifle discharged. The bullet struck Bertha and Hood directly in the heart. She was dead before she hit the ground. Billy dragged her body off the tracks into the ditch, hoping it might appear she had been attacked somewhere else. Then he ran, hid his rifle, and did his best to look like everyone else when the search parties gathered. When investigators turned their attention to Roy and Shorty, both of whom had well-known reasons to resent Bertha, Billy saw his opening. By stepping forward as an eyewitness and pointing the finger at Roy, he could redirect the investigation entirely and recast himself as a helpful, concerned bystander. The plan worked perfectly, right up until his conscience finally destroyed him. Roy Roynes tried to build a life after his release, but it proved nearly impossible. The shadow of a murder conviction, even one that had been vacated, followed him wherever he went. Employers turned him away. Neighbors kept their distance. Within a year of getting out, Roy left Virginia entirely. He drifted west to Tennessee and eventually to Oklahoma, where he worked the oil fields under an assumed name. He never married. He never had children. He died in 1962 at the age of 47 from a heart attack, having spent most of his adult life trying to put distance between himself and a crime he never committed. Shorty Hopkins also left Wise County, his family's reputation shadowed by association with the case. He settled in North Carolina, married, and raised a family. He spoke rarely of Bertha Hood, except to tell his children, whenever it came up, that he had been innocent. That he had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. William Hood lived another 23 years, dying in 1953 at 71. He never fully recovered. His general store, once a place of warmth and community, quietly declined as William lost interest in most everything except sitting on his porch watching the mountains. In his final years, neighbors said, he would walk to Bertha's grave and sit beside it for hours, talking to his daughter in a low voice, as if she could still hear him. The Bertha Hood case became a cautionary tale in Virginia legal circles. A stark example of what happens when assumptions substitute for evidence, when the pressure to close a high-profile case leads investigators to cut corners, and when the testimony of one persuasive witness is allowed to send an innocent person to prison. It also laid bare the fragility of truth in a small and tightly wound community, where family connections could outweigh facts, where poverty could tip the scales of justice, and where a single person's lies could bring down the lives of many others around them. The small white headstone in the cemetery behind the Free Will Baptist Church still stands today, weathered but legible. Bertha and Hood's grave draws historians interested in the case, true crime enthusiasts, and occasionally descendants of the families whose lives were touched by the tragedy. Every November, on the anniversary of her death, someone leaves fresh wildflowers on Bertha's grave. No one has ever claimed responsibility for this. The tradition has continued for decades, long after everyone directly connected to the case has passed on. Perhaps it's a descendant of William Hood, honoring a great-aunt they never had the chance to know. Perhaps it's someone from the wider community, keeping the memory of an innocent girl from fading entirely. Or perhaps it's simply a reminder that in the Cumberland Mountains of Appalachia, where family and honor and memory run deeper than the coal seams buried beneath the earth, some stories never fully let go. Bertha Hood was 15 years old when she died. A girl full of promise, cut down in a moment of drunken recklessness and buried under years of deliberate lies. She never finished school. She never fell in love. She never had children. She never became what everyone around her could see she was going to be. But her story has endured, as a tribute to those who are taken too soon, as a reckoning with the ways justice can fail, and as a reminder of the cost of truth delayed but ultimately brought to light. In the end, 3 lives were destroyed that November evening. Bertha's, ended by a bullet. Roy's, stolen by false imprisonment. And Billy's, consumed first by guilt and finally by the confession that put him behind bars. And a community was left to reckon with the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes the true monster isn't the person standing accused. It's the lie that everyone decides to believe.